Okay, we are recording the parable of the great banquet. And this is found in Luke chapter 14, verses 1 to 24. And I would encourage you to have your Bibles open as we will be looking at this. What I found interesting, the original parable of the great banquet begins in verse 16. However, the broader context has to take us back to verse 1 of chapter 14, and you will realize that there is a wedding feast that is going on before Jesus talks about the great banquet. This is important as I have attempted to teach and to model this thing called context and understanding what comes before and what comes after. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the first 6 verses, and the outline here begins with Jesus exposing legalism. Jesus exposing legalism. In verse 1, it says, "It happened that when he went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Sabbath to eat bread, they were watching him closely." Now, I did not go back and research, but Jesus has been in the home of a number of different Pharisees up to this particular point. It's not that he is a wonderful teacher that they want to sit at his feet and learn. It's because they are trying to provide a social environment where his guard will be let down and they can try to entrap him with questions that, if he answers them, would violate the law. Now, keep in mind, their definition of the law is expanded. It is not only the Mosaic law, known as the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments, it is also the, I believe, 413 or 613 additional interpretations of the law. And many times you will see that Jesus chides them as they try to correct the Lord's disciples that they violate the traditions of the elders. That's those interpretations. Those are those interpretations by the religious group. Now, notice also it's on the Sabbath. And the Jews' concept of the Sabbath starts the night before at sundown, runs through the entire next day until sundown. And according to Mosaic law, which they expanded to such unreasonable interpretations, you could literally do nothing on the Sabbath day. However, the religious leaders were very creative, and one of the laws said that you could only travel so far on the Sabbath and you couldn't go any further. Well, they would map out their route and they would go so far and put something of a household item in the ground, and that they would consider that traveling to their home. And then they would go another distance to another hole in the ground where they had put a household item, and that's how they got around their interpretation of the law. So it's the Sabbath. Nothing is supposed to be taking place. Frankly, this entertainment, this hospitality, should not have been taking place either. But with anybody in legalism, there's always room to go ahead and violate a law, violate a rule. Always an exception to the rule. You've heard that before. And notice in verse 1, it says very clearly, they were watching him closely. This was not a friendly encounter. This was not designed to build fellowship. This was designed to look for a critical entry point to accuse Jesus. Now in verse 2 it says, "And there in front of him," so he's coming in to this Pharisee's home, Remember one of the other parables, the banquet will be in the outer court, a large outer court, and the gates were open, and anybody could come in and out. Anybody could sit in front of a person's house. They had no vagrancy laws back then. So as he enters into this man's house, verse 2, notice there was a man there with dropsy. A man there with dropsy. Now, what in the world is dropsy? It's a disease that occurs mostly in Palestine, in which the limbs and the body are distended with water. Generally, it is confined to the cardiac or renal disease and forms around the abdomen, usually affecting the liver. Let me read that again for you if you're trying to take notes. It is a disease that occurs in Palestine, very similar to malaria, in which the limbs and body are distended with water. In other words, they're bloated. The medical term is anasarca, ANASARCA, ANASARCA. And it's generally a cardiac or renal disease, and it attacks the abdomen and results in liver infection. And so it is a bloating. Now, this person evidently was still able to have movement. So he had not become so distended, so bloated that he could not mobilize, he could not move. Now, Jesus sees this man, and he's in the home of the Pharisee, and he asks a question, verse 3. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees. I'll stop there for a moment so you understand what's going on. Some of the translations would say scribes and Pharisees. The Pharisees were the ruling body of the religion for the Jews, the ruling body in Judaism. The lawyers or the scribes really are two different things. The lawyers were the one who would interpret the law, and the Pharisees would then apply it. The scribes were one who would duplicate the law. In other words, they were responsible for copying. That's what a scribe did, copying the law. And it was a very tedious and meticulous exercise done by the religious group. So Jesus asked them a question, verse 3. Is it lawful? Is there anything in the law that says you can't heal on the Sabbath? A very logical question. In Matthew, Jesus addressed this, but it's a parallel passage. And as he asks that question of the leading religious people of Judaism, notice what they don't do. They don't respond. Verse 4, but they kept silent. And he took hold of the man, healed him, and sent him away. So he healed on the Sabbath. He broke the cardinal rule of the Sabbath. And in verse 5, knowing the wickedness in their heart, he says to them, which one of you will have a son or an ox fall into a well and will not immediately pull him out on a Sabbath day? He takes it now to a logical conclusion. You have an animal, you have a son, you have something that is living and breathing that is precious to you, and it inadvertently or whatever falls into a well. Will you not immediately, will you not pay attention to the situation and pull your son or the ox out of the well, even if it's on the Sabbath day? Notice in verse 6, they did the same thing to the question in verse 4. They didn't make a response to Jesus. They didn't have a reply, because whatever reply they would have had, they would have put themselves on the horns of a dilemma. They would have been wrong. Either way, they had answered the question, because they, first of all, were in violation of the law of the Sabbath themselves. So he exposes legalism. Now I'm going to give you application here towards the end. I don't want to let the cat out of the bag too soon here. So in the first 6 verses, Jesus exposes legalism. And that's what these verses are talking about. Legalism. Remember, the Pharisees and the scribes and the lawyers were very legalistic people. And when you have someone who is legalistic and it's not going their way, they become critical and judgmental. And they look for ways to test. That's what these religious people are doing. Now, listen to me. That is a sad state of affair when someone who is supposed to be leading God's people winds up doing that. That is a terrible situation. Now, in verses 7 to 14, Jesus teaches on self-promotion. So here comes the first parable. In verse 7, and he began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they had been picking out the places of honor at the table. So we're in the same Pharisee's home. This is a wedding feast, verse 8, that Jesus has been invited to. He has already presented his invitation, if you please. I'm Jesus, the giver of life. I'm not a legalist. So he's already declared his position, and they know that because, verse 1, they're watching him closely. So here he walks in, and you can imagine the number of guests, the long tables, cushions for them to sit down on. Remember, they're not sitting at a 21st century table. And the abundance of food spread out in front of the guests, and all of the different servants placing food down, removing dishes, making sure cups are filled. And he notices that people were picking out places of honor. Now, in the American wedding, and probably in most all other weddings as well, there is a head table. Now, at our reception, Carol and I did not have a formal sit-down dinner. We had a brunch, if you please, and it wasn't even a brunch. Her director of food service from Moody Bible Institute baked a cake, or had a cake baked for her, and we just simply served punch and cake and coffee. But there at this wedding feast is a table of prominence, of important people to be seated at in recognition of either their relationship to the bride or to the groom or to the family, or because they were high donors and rollers and givers. I don't know. But there was a place of honor. And Jesus sees them vying for a place of honor. In verse 8, Jesus says this. Now remember, he's an invited guest. Can you imagine me being invited to a wedding reception, and I get up and I start I'm standing there and I'm starting to say, hey, you guys, what are you doing? Find your places and sit down. You're not supposed to be up there. Jesus doesn't quite do that in such a harsh voice or tone, but that's his point here in verse 8. When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor. So all of these people have been invited. there was a place for them to sit. Now, they did not have place cards back then, okay? But there was a place for them to sit. And they knew if they were a person of prominence or not. But yet they wanted to be recognized as someone prominent, sticking their thumbs underneath their armpits and kind of strutting around in their toga, whatever it's called. Verse 8, for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. You don't know who's been invited. What gives you the audacity to look for the most prominent place at this wedding feast? He goes on to say in verse 9, and he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this man. And then in disgrace, you proceed to occupy the last place. So Jesus says, look, you're looking for something that you are not entitled to, even though you think you might be. And what's going to happen as you publicly try to promote yourself, the host is going to come along and say, dear friend, you're sitting in the wrong place. Please go down to the end of the table. Go down to the annex. Go down to the janitor's closets. And you are going to be demoted in front of all the people you were trying to show yourself to be so prominent. Verse 10, Jesus, here's the proper attitude. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place. Find a place where you are not calling attention to yourself, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. Now, I want you to notice something that I just observed. In verse 9, this man is looking to find himself a prominent place, and the host says, get up and hit the road. He doesn't call him anything. But in verse 10, the one who found the last place, if you please, the insignificant place, he calls him friend. That's a very endearing term. That is what Jesus called Judas Iscariot. Friend, do what you've come to do. Now he wraps it up in verse 11 and says this, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. That's the point of this parable here on self-promotion. Allow God to exalt you. God will exalt the faithful and loyal servant, and he will debase the proud. He will bring the proud low. It's a frightening study to do a word search on the word proud and see what the Bible has to say about a proud person and what happens to a proud person or a haughty person. Then Jesus confronts excuses. Now, before we get to that, let's continue in verse 12 of Luke 14. And he also went on to say to the one who had invited him. So now Jesus is not talking to the group, he's talking to the host. He's talking to one of these Pharisees. And he says, look, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, he's not criticizing the activity of the luncheon and the dinner. What Jesus is concerned about is the guest list. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors. Well, why? Otherwise, they may also invite you in return, and that will be your payment. Now, come on, isn't this so characteristic of our culture today, beloved? You go ahead and invite a couple of people over for a barbecue. You might not expect it, but there almost seems to be an implied, well, we need to have them over now because they invited us. And so what have we done? We have become, listen to me, we have become exclusive, not inclusive. Jesus says, look, when you are going to give a reception, here's who you should invite: the poor, the cripple, the lame, the blind. I don't want those people in my home. Those people can't keep the law like I think they should keep the law. They can't measure up to my standards. And perhaps that's the very reason that Jesus scolds this Pharisee about what he should do and what he should not do, because he tells them in verse 14, you will be blessed. You will learn so much. You think that you will be taken advantage of by the poor and the cripple and the lame and the blind? Oh my goodness. They will bless you beyond belief. Why? They don't have the means to repay you. They will be so grateful and thankful for what you have done. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. In other words, caring for these type of people is a true mark of spirituality. James says that very clearly. Let me turn back to James and read you that verse. James chapter 4, as soon as I find James, it's after Hebrews. Now, I always think James is before Hebrews. James is after Hebrews. So in James chapter 1, verse 27, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this. You want to know what Christianity is all about? You want to know what pure and undefiled religion is? Your faith that has no contamination to it, your faith that has no hidden agenda to it. He tells you in verse 27, visit the orphans and the widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Jesus was criticized, was he not, for associating with the poor and the cripple and the lame and the blind and the harlot and the prostitute and the tax collectors. Was he not? Yeah, he was. Why? Jesus stated it very clearly. I came to minister to those who are sick, talking about spiritually. And when he made that statement, he was looking right into the eyes of the Pharisees because they did not think that they were sick. Verse 15, after Jesus is talking to this Pharisee now, there's somebody who was listening. And in verse 15, when one of those who were reclining at the table with him heard this, he said to him, this is a boisterous statement. Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. It's not what Jesus is talking about here. He has misunderstood the message of Christ. Now in 15 to 24, Jesus confronts excuses to the invitation. But he said to him, talking to the man who jumped up and said, oh, everyone's going to be blessed to eat in the kingdom of God. That's not what Jesus said. A man was giving a big dinner and he invited many. And at the dinner hour, he sent his slaves to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. Now, they did not have microwaves. They did not have frozen packages that they could warm up. All of this was done by hand and took time. Have you ever thought how long it took for Abraham to prepare the lamb and the bread for the angel that came down and visited him before they were going to Sodom and Gomorrah? It says clearly, Abraham said, "Hey, can you hang on? Let me fix you a meal." He didn't go to the microwave. He didn't go to the freezer. That was all handmade stuff. So we got this big dinner going on. The guests have been previously invited. And so the slaves go out and say, "Come on, everything's ready. It's time for you now to accept the invitation. Not only hear about it, but accept it. Act on the invitation." Verse 18. But they all alike began to make excuses, justifying why they could not accept the invitation. They heard it, but they were just too busy to accept it. Well, the first one said, verse 18, "I bought a piece of land and I need to go out and look at it. Please consider me excused." That seems like a reasonable request, but remember what day we're on? What day are we on? We're on the Sabbath. He has no business going out and looking at the land. He's violating the Sabbath. Another said, "I bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to try them out. Please consider me excused." What day is it? It's the Sabbath. Another one said, "I have married a wife, and for that reason I cannot come." Now, there is a section of scripture in Deuteronomy that gave military exemption to newlyweds for 1 year. But this was not a military exception. So all of them had excuses. And the slave came back and reported this to his master, verse 21. And the head of the household became angry. He has a righteous anger. He has prepared everything for this banquet for the people. For all of these other people he has invited to come. And they said, "Sorry, can't come." So he tells his slave, verse 21, "Go out at once into the streets and the lanes of the city, and bring in here the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." See, that's exactly what Jesus told the Pharisee to do next time he had the party. And the slave said, "Master, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room." And the master said to the slaves, "Go out into the highways and along the hedges." It's like in the Midwest and in the big cities, you would have people sleeping underneath railroad tracks or underneath viaducts. Go out into the highways and along the hedges and compel them. Don't just say, "Come on, this rich guy's giving you a free dinner." Compel them. It's a very, very strong word. Urge them. Grab them and bring them. It's the same idea of Peter moving among the crowd on the day of Pentecost when they asked him, "What should we do to be saved?" Compel them to come in so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, Jesus said, none of those men who were invited shall taste my dinner. There's a big difference between being invited and accepting the invitation. Now, I've come to realize that there's a slightly different culture up here. Back in the Midwest, when there is a wedding invitations are sent out with an RSVP. You need to respond that you're going to come to the wedding. Now, there's some people who will check off, "Yeah, I'm going to be there," and don't show up. But this is kind of the idea here. This master had sent out an invitation, and people heard the invitation. They seemed to be interested in it, but when something more important came up, their allegiance was shown. I got some land I got to look at. I got some animals I need to test. I got a wife I got to take care of. Excuses. I should have put this on bullet point, but I didn't. Here we go. Here's some lessons. As God's people, we must remind ourselves that ministry to people is more important than and should be put above our personal pleasures and legalism. People are more important than programs. People are more important than something you have put on your calendar. And in our Christian culture today, Christianity is relegated to 10 o'clock until noontime. And after that, we can go to a 50th wedding anniversary. We can go to a 4-year-old's birthday party. We can go to the mall because it's Black Friday. We can do all sorts of things on the Lord's day and not put the Lord first. Colossians says that we have to learn to put God first in all things in our lives. Ministry to people is more important than my pleasures or my legalism. Well, I can't do that because it's Sunday. Now, wait a minute. If it was your child that you got a phone call that is being taken to the emergency room, are you going to say, I'm sorry, I can't come, it's Sunday, I'm supposed to rest? Now, if you make a practice of occupying every Sunday with man-made things that can be done Monday through Saturday, then you're guilty, and so am I. When we put people first, listen to me. When we put people first, it's going to be an inconvenience. It's going to be an inconvenience. Your calendar is going to get rearranged. Different things are going to happen that you did not plan for. But this is where a believer's philosophy has got to shine. And we advocate people are more important. Second of all, as God's people, we must remind ourselves that in due time, according to God's good pleasure, He will exalt His humble and faithful servants. God will do that for us. God exalts the humble and He tears down the proud. I believe James talks about that. When you put people first, you're showing your humility and you're being faithful as an imitator of Jesus Christ. You remember, Jesus had a very busy day of healing people and teaching people. Remember, I think it's in Mark chapter 5. And so he was just looking forward to kind of relaxing, watching the Jerusalem news, maybe having a little leek and garlic salad, maybe some fish skins. I don't know. He was looking to try to relax, okay? And guess what? There's a rap on the door. And as he opens the door, I believe he's staying with Peter's family, mother-in-law. The people are lined up down the sidewalk, around the block. And what does he do? I'm sorry, I got office hours. It's been a long day. You've had this illness for 4 years. One more day ain't going to hurt. What does he do? He gets up and he ministers to the people. We need to be imitators of Christ. We need to be imitators of Christ. Find joy and gladness. Listen to me. Find joy and gladness in the work that God gives to you, whether you're in the spotlight or whether you're in the recesses of a closet. The issue is, I'm serving the Lord wherever I am, no matter what. As God's people, we must remind ourselves that any ministry must be inclusive, not exclusive. We have no right, authorization, there is no scripture that gives credence to targeting a certain group of people and having that be our focus and ministry. Jesus said to his disciples in Matthew chapter 28, go make disciples of all nations. While you are going, the Greek says, make disciples of all nations. Now imagine a Jew back in those days trying to make a disciple of all the various nations that hated the Jews. But yet we find in the New Testament church, it was very, very inclusive. Rich and poor, free and slave. There was no exclusion. And our ministry, our church, has got to be inclusive. Inclusive. We don't invite people to church that look like us. We don't invite people to church that sound like us. We should not invite people to church who act like us. There's enough in our church acting like us. We don't need to bring any more in. We need to be inclusive. And then finally, as God's people, we must remind ourselves that our only responsibility to the Master is to invite whosoever. Their acceptance or rejection, beloved, is their choice. The invited must not only accept, but they need to come to enter. I'm not responsible for their choice. I am responsible to invite. That's what the slaves did. Imagine all the rejection those slaves got initially when they went to all of these hoity-toity people. All the broken promises. And then the master says, well, go out in the highways and the byways. You know that person living underneath the hedge, and you know that one who's got bandages on his arms, and the one with the twisted foot. And imagine going to those people. Imagine their mental state. Oh, they'll never accept. Who am I to judge whether someone's going to accept or not? All I'm supposed to do is invite, like the parable says. Thoughts, questions, comments, criticisms, offering. Oh, I'm sorry, offering. Anybody got any thoughts?
This must pertain to like inviting people to church too, right?
Oh, absolutely, Jeanette. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Yeah. You know where we should start, beloved? Can I take the funnel and let's look at the bottom of the funnel, the little thing down the bottom of the funnel. You know where we ought to start? All those people who have left the church. Just think about those who have left the church for whatever their reasons might have been. I think we need to reach out to them. The Lord has brought in 5 new people to us, and we are extremely thankful for that. And we need to shepherd and guard them. When you see them, You need to be a committee of one. Hey, how you doing today? Patrick had another episode again, and they had to take him up to Sayre. I'm beginning to lose much confidence in Sayre. They sent him home saying, keep your appointment with the cardiologist. We can't do anything for you. I didn't realize they don't have a cardiologist 24/7. They're on call. So when they punch out at 4 o'clock, if they live somewhere else, they have to call them and say, you need to come in. We got this case. But let's just start in our own backyard. Think of people who used to come to the church and reach out to them, make a phone call to them. Hey, I know you haven't been here for a while, and I don't quite know what the reasons are, but the Lord is starting to rebuild the church. We want you to be a part of it. There's that social activity coming up this Saturday. It's okay if you bring people with you and they're not on the list. Don't worry about that. Bring them. There's the Taco Fiesta thing coming up in August. We're going to have a harvest dinner or party in October sometime. Different things that you can invite them to. You know what the online programming is going to be on Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. We're in the book of Hebrews. So many things that you can say, hey, come. God is encouraging us. We've been through a rough time. Come find out why Christ is better. All right, I'll stop preaching. We'll take up the offering. Any other thoughts or questions? Jeanette, you look like you want to say something.
No.
No? Okay.
No, I'm good.
All right. Thursday, Ezekiel. And if you have the time, I want you to read Ezekiel. Hang on here. I want you to read Ezekiel 33 and ask the Lord to speak to you. That is the believer's.
Did you say 33?
Yeah, Ezekiel 33. I believe that is the believer's call to duty. There's that Xbox game, Call to Duty. Well, God gave Ezekiel a call to duty, and it's relevant for today. So we're in Ezekiel Thursday. Sunday night, we're going to begin to talk about, do a biblical study on hell. What is hell like? How does the Bible describe hell? Who created hell? When was it created? What are the different names in the Bible used for hell? Some of them are not used properly, by the way. So we're going to start a Bible study on hell. Sunday morning, we are going to be hopefully going through Hebrews chapter 7, Melchizedek, and understanding why Christ is better than Melchizedek. It's a long chapter, but I think we can make it through. All right. Dave texted me. Pat has been walking in the hallway up there in the hospital. They took out her epidural. Is that like a pain thing or something? Epidural? Jeanette? Yes.
Yes,
Sue, go ahead.
it is.
Okay. They removed that. She was sitting up in bed, having her lunch, doing Sudoku. So she must be feeling a little bit better. I think she might.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I think she might be released maybe by the end of this week to go home and spend with Dave. Like I said, Patrick had another episode last night. They released him, and he is back home. I've called. He's got an appointment Thursday, but he has not communicated to me who, what, when, where, how. He wanted me to go with, but I don't know what's going on. I was going to go out and visit him today, but they did not return a phone call to me. His sister is there helping out with the kids. Let's see. I've not heard from Robert. Annette is starting to feel better with her sprained ankle. What else am I missing, guys? I think those were the major ones, wasn't it, Karis?
Sue Hitchcock's mother, she was supposed to be put into
I believe
Uh,
she was put in. I believe she was put into a.
Rehab.
Thank you kindly, Carl. Rehab. I saw. Today's Tuesday. I saw Susan down at Miller's yesterday trying to get a prescription filled. She seemed very distracted. Understandably so. We didn't have a lot of time to talk. She's leaving, I think, Friday or Saturday to go to Delaware with a girlfriend. I guess every year they go and celebrate their birthdays together up there in Delaware. So, Sunday bulletin will be a little bit different. I am not putting together a prayer sheet like I did before, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. What I have chosen to do is, I don't know whether you can see that.
mark your calendar.
Yeah,
There we go.
yeah, mark your calendar. See what it says?
Focused prayer.
It's prayer.
Focused prayer. And what I've done is the prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. This week, let's
Yeah.
join our hearts in fervent prayer and intercession for our nation. And I've given you 3 or 4 different passages that you can use in prayer for our nation. I think, as I've mentioned to a couple of you, I think we need to get more focused in our prayer and our intercession. And I hope that not only on Sunday morning prayer time, but with this, hopefully people will take it and use it. The guys on the council have something specific that we are working on as well. All right, any other thoughts? Any other questions?